Forgive me, we're going to move pretty fast in this video, but I did want to just give you an overview of how Radium works, show you how to load things in, how to record stuff, how to do some simple modulation, use the effects rack. This will be a single longer video that just kind of walks you through loading sounds and playing them and things like that. So I have here a database and I have just two different sounds and I'll explain why in a second. The first are some electrical zaps and this other one, the electrical zaps sound like this. And the other file is a set of little dog vocals that I recorded many years ago. This crazy dog. So we're going to use those two to load into Radium to play a little bit. So how do you access Radium? Well, there's a few ways. You can go into the window menu and say view Radium sampler window. It's here. There's also a toolbar icon. And if you don't see it, you could right click and say customize the toolbar. And you'll find it basically in here somewhere. And you can drag it up to the top. It's right here, Radium Sampler. I already have it on my toolbar, so I'm going to click it. And when I do, you'll see that basically Radium comes to the foreground. We see the various parts. Again, the sample slots over here on the left, the amplitude, pitch, the XY, the waveform, and the modulation section, and the envelope section, and the effects rack. Well, let's go back for a second to SoundMiner, and to the SoundMiner browser, I should say. We've always been in SoundMiner. But let's pick this sound to start with. Let's say I want to load this sound into Radium so that I can start playing with it. Well, it's very easy to do. I can either go into the sampler menu and I can say load into sample slot 1. Okay, so now that sound is loaded into Radium. We can see the nice waveform here. It's the entire sound file that is loaded. But let's say I don't really want to load this entire sound file. I only really want a section of this. So I'm going to clear this. Actually, I don't even have to clear it. I'm going to go back to SoundMiner. And instead, I'm going to make a selection around, let's say, this part of the file here. And I'm going to drag a selection around this, okay? And now I'm going to go back to Radium, and I'm going to load that. And now pressing load again, it's simply going to load it right on top and clear the old one. So just be aware of that. There won't be any warning. It's just going to go ahead and load that. Well, now I have a much more manageable section of the sound file to work with. Now, how to play sounds. I need a Midi keyboard, as I mentioned earlier. I could come down here and press a key here and hold it down. And the file will play, and I could play a lower note or higher note. But really, to be useful, Radium requires some kind of a Midi keyboard. Now I have a lot of them attached, but I'm going to choose with this button up here which controller I want Radium to listen to. And Radium can actually listen to two different controllers, and we'll get into that later, why you might want to use two different controllers. But for now, I'm going to choose V61, which is my Alesis V61, a little 61 key simple controller that's right in front of me. So Radium is now listening to that. So now, and I'll set up a camera later to show the keyboard because it'll be useful, I think, later. But for now, just know that I'm going to press middle C, which is C3, and hold it down. And I can play down an octave by pressing C2. Or way down with C1. Okay, first thing to notice is I've got this silence at the head. I did that intentionally to show you that within the waveform here, I have start and end control. So I don't want that silence to play every single time. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to just actually move it somewhere where I want to trigger. So now when I press the key, right, it plays fairly instantly. And the same thing, I have some space at the end that I don't really need, so let's just trim that out. So now if I held down this key long enough, it would play from the beginning to end. And I'll do it on a really high octave just because it'll go much faster. There you go. And now you've seen that it plays this entire range. Okay, so next let's look over here at the sample slot really quickly to realize that I have a solo and I have a mute. Now, this is the only sound that's loaded in, so they won't really have any effect. I also have a meter. Sidechain we're going to ignore for now, and release trigger we're going to ignore. But I have the name of the file here as well, which helps me figure out which sound is loaded into which slot. Now, over here I have the amplitude gain, and I can simply adjust the volume up or down. That's too loud, so I'm just going to bring it down. That's too quiet. I'll just double click it. Any control you have in Radium, you can simply double click it to reset it to its original default position. And that's actually fine. Maybe I'll bring it up a little bit. It's very sensitive. Okay. Now, attack and decay, sustain, hold, and release. I'll get into more, but the attack is basically how fast the note will come on. So if I press the note right now, the sound starts instantly. If I drag it up a little bit, the sound kind of ramps in. Release is the exact opposite, how quickly the sound ramps off at the very end of a key press when I release it. I let go right now, the sound stops instantly. If I drag it up a little bit, and you can see that they're not exactly in the exact same ratio. Release is much, much longer, so it's a little more finicky maybe, but it's a little shorter one. There you go. We'll leave DS and R for now. They're a little more advanced, and I rarely use them. Now we have the pitch wheel, and I have a pitch wheel here on my keyboard, so as I'm holding down middle C, let me reset my ADS HR controls. So this control here tells Radium how much to basically change the pitch when I move the pitch wheel to its extremes. So right now it's 12 notes up and down, basically an octave up and an octave down, but I can change this by clicking over it and pulling it. So I can say go down 48 notes and go up 48 notes. And now watch how wildly this pitch changes. It's going to sound completely weird, but I can do something like this. Right, which is way too much. I'm going to just double click this, put these back to 12. Now lag is interesting. Listen to when I move the pitch wheel really fast. That has a sort of unnatural sound to it a lot of times, and so lag can allow you to basically smooth out the pitch wheel. And actually, if you hold down Option and click it, it'll set it to 1 second. And now I'm going to move the pitch wheel up and down quite fast, but watch what happens to the sound. Right, it just smooths out that pitch wheel operation. So again, I'll just leave that at 1000 milliseconds. I usually do leave this because I find that the pitch wheel responds a little bit too fast and doesn't sound that natural. Now, tuning, again, I can change I'm going to always press middle C here, but I can push middle C here. I can then pull this down an octave. So still by pushing middle C, it's the equivalent of playing C2. Pull it down 2 octaves, it's the equivalent of playing C1. And this is really useful when offsetting one sound against other slots. So you might find that this sound is too low pitched or too high pitched compared to some other sounds you're going to balance it with. So that's really why you would use this. Now, ratio is the other one. This is just semitones and sense, just a finer control. And one thing to note within Radium is that if you hold down the command key, you have finer control over these parameters as well. So you move the mouse more, but it responds like less. Okay. Double-clicking anything resets it. Now, ratio is interesting and one that's pretty useful. So right now, when I play across the keyboard from low, right, the pitch changes accordingly and the time changes accordingly. I'm playing it at much faster speed or a much slower speed, lower pitch. Ratio basically has a control over that. So if I pull this all the way to the left, and now I play any note on my keyboard, I'm going to play from C1 all the way up to, C8. Right, the pitch is not changing at all because I've set the ratio to basically 0. So the key commands don't really affect pitch at all. There are reasons why you might want to do this, and we'll look at them later. And live pitch is a lot like the pitch wheel, but it can be used with the modulation section, and that's why it exists, and we'll show you that a little bit later. Okay, over here in the waveform area, I have 4 basically envelopes that I can play with. And let me just show them to you really quickly. The first one is an amplitude. Now you see that the waveform stays visible. It kind of grays out a little bit, and you see this line across the top. This is the amplitude line. So if I click a point to make a new point, click another one and drag it down, when I push this sound and let it play across there, you'll see that the volume is simply going to fade to nothing. Right, and now even though I'm still playing, because the amplitude line is drawn all the way down, it's not going to play anything. I could have it come back up, so I can do some really, really fast things like this, if I really wanted to. Now, the thing that's important to know is that this is tied to the length of the sample. So if I play this lower or higher, this line plays in reference to the sped up sample or slowed down sample, right? It's not independent of the sample length. I can right click at any point and then reset it. I can also right click and invert it. I can basically, holding down Option, I can drag curves with in between points. So if I want to do something like this, make a point and drag the curve. Okay, double clicking a point will remove it. And again, I can simply right click and reset it. So I also have a pitch, so I can do something like this. Again, very similar to using the pitch wheel or even the live pitch, except that this can be reproduced over and over and over again, right? And again, if I play it high or low, it stays linked with the sample length. That's the most important thing to realize about these. I'm going to reset this. Then you have these generic envelopes, and they're simply lines that you can use to draw in modulation parameters. So I'm going to just draw something that looks like this. And now I'm going to show you our sample start is here. So it's going to start this line and go here. Should make it a little shorter. And let me show you really quickly what you could do with that. Now, again, this is going to be a really quick overview, but I'm going to come down to the modulation section and I'm going to add a new modulator. And I'm going to choose from it basically envelope 1, which is what I've drawn this thing on. And now I can map that to something. I can really map it to almost anything, but I'm going to, just as an example, map it to the panner and have this line basically be a pan line. So I can turn on the stereo panner. And under the destination, I'm going to choose in here, stereo panner, pan. Okay. And you'll see that this little light down here is red, indicating that this effect module is now active. And when I play a sound, watch what happens to this pan knob. Right? It has basically controlled this line, now this pan knob. And anywhere that I start, so if I move the if I go back here to hide that and I move the start point to about here, watch down here, as soon as I hit play, the pan knob immediately started at this position. It jumped exactly to that to control that. So these are what the envelopes are useful for. And again, the same things apply. I can basically double click and make as many points as I want, or click as many points as I want, and then hold down Option to create some curves in there. Anything like this that I want to do, I can do. I can also hold down Shift and slide this entire envelope left and right, so that if I realize I like this shape, but I kind of want it to be longer, I can just do that by holding down Shift and sliding that. And again, I can basically invert that if I wanted to. So now I have, the pan would go the other direction, which is a useful thing to be able to do. And I could copy this envelope and paste it, for example, under pitch. So I can right click and say paste current envelope. And now the pitch is going to also have this shape. In addition to the pan, like all of these are active at the same time. Envelope 3 isn't doing anything, or envelope 2, I mean. So again, I'm going to right click and I'm going to reset these. I want to get these all back to normal. And so that's what these do. Okay. I can flip the channels, which you can't really see, but it did flip left and right channels. And I can hit reverse, which again, in this sound probably won't sound that different, but now, one thing to note is that the panner is still active and it remembers the last place that it was. So I do want to come down here and either double click this back to the center, or better yet, I'll just turn off the panner for now. This sound is now playing in reverse. Now, what you can't do here is to basically change what's loaded into this slot here. I can't trim this file. I can't take sections of it out. And that's what this recall sound button is useful for. So if I click this and then I go back to SoundMiner, it's put that sound back down here in the Waveform browser, and it's highlighted the section that's in Radium. So now if I wanted to, for example, change a different section, I can select a new section and come back here and just load that. And now that section is loaded. Okay, so we've kind of covered very, very briefly these things. The XY joystick we'll leave for later because that's just an advanced way of modulating things. But let's look really briefly here at these. And I'm going to be very, very brief here because this is a complex thing. But let's look at the LFOs, for example. I'm going to clear this modulation right now because I don't want it on there anymore. Well, actually, I can just leave it and I'll just remap it. So I'm going to basically say, instead of envelope 1 up here controlling the pan, let's tell it to use LFO 1. Okay, so this is an LFO. And it's running all the time in this shape. Basically, it just continually runs back and forth. Not back and forth, it keeps running forward. and this shape. And already, because I've mapped this here, you can see that down here, if you look under the panner, it's just sitting there going left and right and going crazy. It's just going to sit there and play over and over. Now, if I play a sound, nothing really happens because the panner is actually not active, even though it's being controlled. I have to turn it on by by clicking the power button. And now when I play this sound, hopefully you'll be able to hear this. Right, it's panning back and forth. Now, under the modulation section, you have basically phase flip, glide controls for certain things. Here's the rate that this LFO is running. So if I just drag this up, you can see the panner is now going completely bonkers. It's going so fast you can't really even hear it, but I can control the rate at which the LFO is performing. So I can get it to go quite slow, for example. And now it's just doing a slow pan from left to right. I also have a range control. So if I don't want it to pan all the way hard left and all the way hard right, I can drag these in a little bit and constrain the panner basically to a certain range. And now if you look, you'll see that it's getting, somewhat to the right, somewhat to the left, but not all the way as far as it could go, right? So that's what the LFOs do. They just sit there. And I can basically change the shape of the LFOs by clicking the gear here. I could put a preset, for example, of a square wave, or there are presets for some different shapes, sawtooth wave, triangle wave, things like that. Again, just remember that this thing just sits there and goes over and over and over again by default. Once it's on, and I could disable it, I can turn the power off and you'll see that the panner stops. But when it's on, it's just going to sit there and make this shape over and over again. I'm going to go ahead and clear that out. And I'm going to reset the panner here and turn it off. So let's look at time-specific pitch, for example, for a second. Let me just turn off the oscillators. It's not doing anything, but let's just leave them off for now. Let me turn on time-specific pitch. Now, I showed you that we have this pitch up here. And again, let me just show you. I can draw basically a pitch from fast to slow. I'm going to hold down middle C. Now I'm going to hold down C4, or actually C5. Right, we know that this pitch line here is tied to the sample length. Let me reset this. The TSE pitch, or time-specific envelope pitch, is not tied to this length. It's tied to a specific length, and that length is set over here. So I'm going to set this to 1 second. Okay, so now this pitch is going to, when I draw a pitch range here, is going to play for 1 second. So I'm going to play middle C. And you see that basically for the first second of whatever it needed to play it, it performed this. Now the difference is that no matter what key I press, this pitch is always going to take 1 second. So let me play up an octave. Now you see it didn't really reach the bottom until almost the end of it. If I play lower, it reaches the end of this pitch much, much sooner and then stays down here for the remainder of as long as I'm holding the key down. So I hope that makes sense. Again, we're going to dive into this much, much more detail. There's all kinds of different settings you can do and things to change these, but you have a Doppler, you have a high and low pass, you have pan, you have amplitude, you have direction. You can basically have the sound reverse itself by creating a node and doing something like this. Let me turn the pitch off and turn this one on, sorry. Right, so as soon as it hit that point in the time, about 1 second in or whatever it was, it basically just reversed. Same thing if I play it lower. It did it sooner. If I play it higher, it seems to get farther into the sample because it's time-based and not length-based of the sample itself. It's independent of whatever sample. This could be a 5-minute sample or a 3-second sample. This is always going to perform at this sort of ratio. And again, we'll dive into this much, much more. I'm going to clear this and I'll turn that off. I usually leave these off until I want to use them. LFO 1 and 2, I think, default to be on. But again, until you actually map them to something, they don't hurt anything. They're sitting there, I suppose, running, but they're not doing much. All right, again, modulation we kind of already looked at, but just to show you that basically you have lots of things that you can modulate. You can take the envelope of one of the slots, which is sort of the volume shape, and map it somewhere else. You have the LFOs and the envelopes. You have a bunch of random generators we'll look at, playback chants, which is really fun. You have emitters, which are really cool, that just sit there and emit over and over again. You have the joystick controls, which are here, which we can map in and out of the joystick to other parameters. And then under destinations, you can basically map to the start point, the end point, the loop start end, the master volume, the pitch mod, or any of the plugin parameters that are down here in the effects rack. So you have a lot of ways to control things here, and we'll look at this in much, much more detail. So we looked at the effects rack, but again, really briefly, this is also independent of modulation. I don't have to use this along with a modulation. So let me just go ahead and clear this. And let's just go back here. I'm going to press middle C. I can hold down Option and turn on any of these effects that I want. So I can turn on a flanger by holding down Option and clicking it. I can also just come here and turn it on. But Option clicking it basically also brings it into focus. So now I have a flanger. There's a saturator, which will basically just give me some loudness. There's a shuffler that'll pan the thing sort of back and forth automatically for me. A little bit hard to tell on this sound. Holding down Option again will disable them. There's a master bypass button too, so if I've turned on a bunch of effects, let's say, and I want to turn off all of them temporarily, I can just bypass the effects rack. Now, they're all still lit up, but they're basically no longer playing, so turn it back on. Right? And again, Option clicking them will basically turn them off. You have the ability to host plugins directly in here as well, which we'll get into later. And you also have the ability to record each individual slot separately if you didn't want to record the master. But let's say we wanted to actually record a file now really quickly. So how do we do that? Well, under the transfer areas here, I'm going to click and say set the transfer path. And I'm going to choose this folder and I'm going to say open. And now whenever I hit record up here, it's basically going to record the file into that location. So I'm going to do is hit record. And what you realize is the counter hasn't started. And you're like, well, wait, I just hit record. What's going on? Radium will wait until the first MIDI note on to start the actual recording. So now when I push middle C and perform something, right? And now I can pause that. If I wanted to, for example, make a few changes to some parameters, let's say, okay, I realize I want to come in here to pitch and actually do something like this. Now I want to start recording again, so I'm going to hit pause again. Right? And when I hit stop, you'll see that that recording comes down here. Now, I have my naming options. There are some naming options we'll look at more later to just name this automatically test Radium record. But I can right-click at this point and rename this file to whatever I want. Electric Mayhem Fun 01, whatever I want to call it. And from here, I can basically reveal this recording in the Finder by right-clicking and saying reveal. And I spelled it wrong, of course. But if I play it now, you'll hear. And in addition, what SoundMiner did was it went ahead and loaded that performance, this file, over into the Waveform browser. And it put it right down here. So now I can play it right from here. Play from the beginning. Now, it didn't make a record up here into the database. There's a way to do that. But it does load into the browser so that from here I could immediately take a section of this and spot it directly into Pro Tools, for example. So I can work with this file immediately. So you get the sense of how easy it is to move a file from the SoundMiner browser into Radium, record something, and then load it right into Pro Tools. I'm going to mute this slot for a second and come to slot 2. And I want to show you one other quick thing, which is that there are two ways to load a sound into the Radium. The first one we showed you was basically to either load the entire sound file or to drag just a selection of it to load it. And that works basically in single mode. So that file is loaded and it's just one big long piece, right? You can see there are no interruptions or no breaks in it at all or things like that. So if I want to change where it plays from, unmute it, I have to drag the start point and use the end point and things like that. Oh, one thing I should show you really quickly before we move on, I'm going to reset this, is that you can basically loop this too. So I can go to loop mode and say loop forwards, for example. And now I have separate loop start and end points that are generated by these little pills here, but I can also drag them here with this control. So let me pull them in a little bit and let's set them within the start and the end point. And we'll put a little crossfade so that as it moves from here to here, it fades the sound a little bit. So now watch what happens when I hold the key down. Right? It just keeps looping, and I have different modes. I can loop forward and backwards. I could loop forwards, then backwards. My personal preference is to usually use forward backwards looping. It's the smoothest. And there's something called one shot. Now, by default, if I press the key, I'm going to put no looping. I press the key and let go. right? It just stops whenever I stop. But one shot will basically, I'm going to press the key and immediately let go. One shot forces the entire start to end to play. So if I push, one, I just rapidly push a bunch of keys. Now I immediately let go as soon as I push those, but you see in one-shot mode, it plays the full thing. Okay, so that's looping in its very rudimentary form. I'm going to mute this again and go back to sample slot 2. I'm going to go back to SoundMiner browser, and I'm going to choose this file, which is a bunch of these dog things that I mentioned earlier. Now, these are a bunch of little sound files sort of independent, and I don't really want to load this as one long sound file. I want to load each of these kind of to map it to a key or do something like that. What I've done at the top here is defined what are called radium regions. And again, we'll get into much more detail about this later, but you can see there are little selections above each sound. And I can basically clear them or remove them, but I've already made them, so I'll just show you that to make one, you basically drag a selection around a sound, and you push R to create a region up at the top. So I've already done that. So now watch what happens when I load this sound into Radium. Because there are defined regions, when I push load, it looks like it's loaded the entire sound file. But what you see at the top here are all of these green bars that represent the actual regions that I've loaded in. Now watch what happens. I'm going to play middle C over and over again, and just watch what happens. Watch the cursor. Just played that one for some reason. Now it played that one. And then this one. It's randomly playing the regions. And this is by design. This is intentional. And what it will do is basically randomize the playback of these regions. And I can also pitch them, of course. But it's going to play them in random fashion. This is really cool because it means that you'd get some variation. If I want to make some layers of some creatures or some dog vocals, or some pitches, right? I can do those things just because of the nature of how this has loaded these different samples in. Now, what I was talking about earlier is that I cannot make any changes. I can't change the length of these here if I realize the start and the end don't really do what I would want them to do here anyway. But I can push recall sound. And when I go back, it's basically loaded the sound back here, and those regions are still defined. And here I could come back in, and I could change the start and the end point of these regions if I wanted to. I could also just remove them all and realize, okay, I actually don't want all of those. I can basically also use SoundMiner's auto suggest to basically define them. So I can click underneath it and push R to define that one. Let's say I want that one, and I want this one, and I want this one. So now I only have 4 basically defined. So now when I go back to Radium and push load again, I'm just going to overwrite this. Again, the entire file looks like it's loaded, or at least enough of the file to show me the entire range of selection. But nothing in the middle here is ever going to play because they're not defined as regions. So now I only have 4 defined regions. So if I just play over and over again, it's only going to play these 4 potential things. And you see this playing randomly. It doesn't just cycle through them in some order. It really does randomly pick one. Now, let's say I don't want that. Let's say I want to basically have one of these mapped to each key. Again, we'll go into this much more detail later, but let me go back to recall the sound. And I'm going to go back here. And let's define some more regions. So I've got only 4 defined, so let's drag a selection and let's define, 7 or 8 different regions, okay? I'm just going to pick this one. That one's already picked. Just something like this. So again, I'm just hitting R on the keyboard to define these Radium regions. And now I've got a bunch of them. This will be fine. Okay, I'm going to go back to Radium. I'm going to load this back on top, and you'll see that I now have, 8 or 9 of these. So again, it's going to play them randomly right now. And it's going to play them at different pitches. Well, let's say I don't want that. I'm going to click on the keyboard, and I'm going to push C3. And when I do that, another menu pops up, and it asks me what I want to do. And what I could do is basically say, I want to map each of these regions to a separate key, chromatically starting at C3. So when I do that, you'll see that each of these regions has now been assigned a particular key. So this allows me to reproduce the sound over and over. So if I push C3 now, C3 is always this region. So D3 is always this one, right? And you don't forget, this one is not defined, so it's never going to play. But C sharp is this. D sharp, E. The next region that's defined is here. This is mapped to F. F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, and B, and C, the next C up. So what that enables me to do is to always perform those exact things. Now you notice they're not changing in pitch, right? I've mapped them chromatically to the keys, but the pitch could be adjusted by the pitch wheel. And again, playing a note outside of that range will do nothing because these regions are only mapped to this set of keys. Okay, so I can right click and I could say basically map them around, well, let's click on C3. I could map them around C3 so that C3 is the middle of them now and it maps them from low to high, or I could say map them, again, starting at C3 and they map to the right. I could say map one region per octave. This is pretty cool. So now it does allow me to pitch that particular one, but it has it confined it to a pitch range. Right? So again, we'll get into this in much more detail later, but just to show you that you have quite a few options of how to pitch match something. So I'm going to just choose this and click on C3 and tell it to play back in random order. Right, and now it's pitch mapped them anywhere that I play, and it's pitching them accordingly and things like that. So that's the default mode, and I'll just leave it there for now. Okay, wow. Well, that was a long video. And again, I really glanced over a lot of this, but I think I gave you kind of an example of how we can use Radium. And of course, I can unmute this one and play them. Right, which is completely pointless. But the idea here is that I could layer a bunch of sounds together. I can solo or mute some of them. I can do all kinds of things. And now we're going to look at a quick video on sort of some of the customizing things that you probably want to do before you really start using Radium. Things like setting up your MIDI controller, a few preference settings that probably are important to sort of do before you really start working with it, because they might bite you later on if they're set wrong or you're not aware of how they're set. So we're going to do that next, and that'll kind of wrap up this first set of videos, and then we'll really start breaking it down. We'll start diving into each part of this over and over, and we'll really start explaining all the nuances of each part. But next up, just a video on how to customize Radium.